My name is Bob Brucker. I'm the founder and board president of AgeWise Colorado, and our executive director, Barbara Boyer, is on here. Raised her hand. I'm just going to give you just a little bit of background about AgeWise, and then I'll turn this over to Jamie. Well, I said I was going to do that. Okay, here we go. So we launched AgeWise last year in the summer, and our aim is to be the premier resource hub for aging Coloradans and their families. We're working to appeal to both the sandwich generation, the people 40 to 60 roughly, and those who are older. So there are about 2.5 million people in Colorado who are over the age of 40. So we're all about helping people age well and age wisely. Many people don't know about this little demographic chart here, but in the year 2030, which is really not very far away from us, our over age 65 population will exceed the number of people under the age of 18 for the first time ever. That has a lot of implications for our economy and for our society as well. Some of the services that we focus on, including in our AgeWise Colorado website, are located here. Today we're talking about end-of-life planning, but we've had previous webinars on a variety of different topics kind of around this board here. And who do we serve? Actually, all these people, older Coloradans, the adult children of older Coloradans, service providers, employers. There is a way to make that actually make a lot of sense, because it can be a benefit to employees to relieve stress and provide support, have a place for them to go when they need when they need to find information, and make sure it's reliable information. And let's see here. Now I'm going to introduce to Jamie. I have an introduction here. For those of you who don't know her, it sounds like a lot of you do. So, but we'll get rolling with that. And I would ask everyone to, if you're willing to put your contact information into our chat for today, that would be helpful. We'll be in touch with you probably about if you're going to sign up for our newsletter or whatever. So Jamie's calling is helping people be less afraid of death. By arranging for them to provide their loved ones with a planned and funded funeral or memorial service, together we create a path for bereavement long before it's needed. And by facing their mortality, clients can live better and more meaningful lives. Jamie brings deep experience in death care discussion and conversation to a broad range of audiences around the country, sharing insights and approaches on how to have those difficult conversations and how to address sensitive issues. Extending well beyond death and dying, her message resonates across industries and individuals, bridging her passion to demystify death while enlightening communicators on overcoming challenging conversations. So we're all looking forward to hearing from you, Jamie, and just take it away. I'll shut off this other screen. And
thank you, Bob. I really appreciate it. And I'm really honored to be here with all of you. I'm grateful for you to all make time to get here today. You know, we live in this society that says you shouldn't talk about death. You shouldn't think about death. If you do, that's really morbid. And I'm really working against that. So what I am hoping is that you will all be ambassadors for having conversations about death. Because really, aside from birth, death is the only experience each of us is going to have And if we're lucky enough to have loved ones in our life, we're going to experience their deaths as well. And it's really important that we learn how to talk about this stuff and really turn on the lights, because anything that is in the dark is really a lot scarier. I don't know about you, but sometimes I wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and I'm really freaking out and I can't sleep and I'm so agitated. My heart is racing. And then when the sun comes up and I kind of think about what was causing me so much agitation, I think, oh, that's not such a big deal. And there's something about the darkness that really makes things a lot scarier. And so my goal is to bring all of these conversations out into the sun so we can look at them, we can think about them, we can be more in control of something that really is very uncontrollable and is deeply psychologically challenging. So I am grateful that you are here. And I would really ask that you contribute, that you ask questions, that you share with the group. I've been doing this work for a long time, almost 13 years, and I'm definitely an expert at this. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions. They're almost invariably prefaced with, I have the weirdest question. It's never a weird question. It's almost always a question that I have heard many times before. I'll be thrilled if you ask me a question I haven't heard before. So please don't hesitate. You can do that in the chat. You can raise your hand physically, or you can raise your hand in the reactions. If you're familiar with Zoom, you'll know that at the bottom of your screen, there is a little reactions place. Please feel free to put your hand up. And Barbara and Bob, I'm going to ask you to both help me in seeing what's going on in the chat, and also helping me if people raise their hand, because I can't see everybody at once.
Sure.
And I really do want to make sure that you walk away from today's meeting getting the information that brought you here. So I have some things I want to impart, but most important is to make sure you get your needs met. So please, please share with me what your needs are. So often people ask me how I got into this, so I'd like to just start with that. As I said, I've been working with Feldman Mortuary for almost 13 years. I'm the director of pre-planning. And quite honestly, I didn't know anything about funerals. I've been to some, but I didn't know much at all. And I am not a psychologist. I'm not a social worker. I just was always someone who was good at talking about hard stuff. I like having deep and important and vulnerable and authentic conversation. And so when I learned that the 4th generation owner of Feldman Mortuary, and by the way, we are the oldest family-owned mortuary in Colorado. When I heard that he was looking for someone to do this job, I called him and I said, I am the right person. I don't know how I had that chutzpah, but I grew up with him, so I was pretty safe. And I just knew it was exactly what I was supposed to be doing. And I have created the whole position. He didn't have anybody in this role before, and have really found it is my calling. And it has worked really well in our community, because now so many more people are starting to talk about this. And I feel like I am helping to drive a cultural shift that says it really is safe and smart to talk about death long before it's needed, and get all these plans put in place, which really gives each of the people I work with a sense of peace And it really helps their loved ones at the time of death to have a path to walk on when they need it most. So we can talk about all kinds of things around this. I'm not a lawyer, but I definitely know about how important it is to have advanced directives put in place. How many of you, by show of hands, have your advanced directives, meaning you have your powers of attorney, living will, any other documents that you need? So far, I'm seeing 3 hands. I have mine. 5, 6, 7, 8. Wow, that's pretty good. You know, 70% or more of people die without having those documents in place. And many of us, when we get them, don't review them. So I encourage you to go back to the documents if you already have them. Take a look at them every 3 to 5 years. Make sure that the people you put in place are still the ones you want to be in charge of things. And often people put their children in those roles. And that's fine, but keep in mind that it's not an honor. So don't do it just because somebody is your child. Do it because they are the right person who can have a steel spine if they need to make sure that your needs are going to be met. Because of course, powers of attorney are in place for when you cannot speak for yourself. And so you want to make sure that the people you put in charge of speaking on your behalf are the right people. And sometimes that's going to be your oldest child, but sometimes it's going to be somebody you hire. And there can really be good reasons to hire somebody. And the other thing that is so important is that you have conversation around this. You know, many of us will have a living will that will say something like, if I have, you know, I'm in a situation in which I would have to be put on a respirator, here's what I want to have happen. Or if I needed to have, if I needed to be fed with a feeding tube, here's what I would want to happen. But that's pretty much it. And we're not telling our agents, the people who are going to be in charge, when those things matter to us or what will matter about it. And the vast majority of us are not going to face those kinds of situations. Like the reason you might be put on a ventilator, I would have said this pre-COVID, but maybe you're like my friend Mike, who was playing tennis and had an arrhythmia and collapsed on the tennis court. And an ambulance came and put him on a ventilator. And he had a living will that said what he wanted. And really, he didn't want to ever be put on a ventilator, but he was, because that's what happens. His wife had his living will, and it said that he shouldn't be on a ventilator for longer than 3 days. However, his wife didn't present that to the hospital because she had young kids who needed a chance to get their mind around this. His parents needed a chance to get their mind around it. And that worked out, you know, as well as it could. And after that happened to my friend Mike, my husband and I went back to our estate planner and we revised our documents with that in mind. And we talk about what we want. But the vast majority of us are going to face something more like a chronic illness. We're not going to have typically that emergent thing. We're going to have something like, you know, dementia that we're going to be cared for in a chronic way. And so it's so important that we are having conversations with our loved ones about what gives our lives meaning.
Amy, let me interrupt you for a second. Bernard has his hand up.
Bernie, go ahead.
Are you going to discuss the MOST order?
I can only talk about it in a little bit. I will happily speak to it, but I'm not an expert in it. Is everybody familiar with the MOST form? And I don't
Oh,
remember what it stands for.
there are very few people who seem to understand it. And it's different from an advance directive because it is a medical order. And all of the other advance directives are recommendations.
Right, great point. Thank you for bringing that up. And a big difference there is that the MOST form is written by your doctor. As Bernie said, it is a medical order. And the advance directives are written by a lawyer. And so those things don't always cross over. And that is actually really why it's super important to be having conversation with your loved ones who will be making the decisions. And when you get to a time frame in your life that it does make sense to do that with your doctor, you should absolutely be doing that. And the MOST form would actually be kept in your chart. Bob, would you speak to it a little bit?
The MOST form?
I see you put it in the chat, but maybe you could just
Yeah,
say it.
I'm just reading here off what I've pulled up. It's a
Oh,
doctor.
okay.
It's just a doctor's order that helps you keep control over your medical care. So it stands for, what does it stand for?
Medical orders for scope of treatment.
Yeah, there you go. So, okay.
So, we wouldn't all be in a position to have one. Like, I don't think at 52, I have no health issues that my doctor would be, there's not a lot to say for mine yet. But at times of our life, it is really important that we bring that up with our doctor and talk about, is it the right time to get a MOST form put in place? And Bernie, I appreciate you bringing it up. And it really is going to speak to lots more things than the living will speak to. Susan, do you have a question or comment, Susan Mackey?
I'm sorry, I forgot I put that up there. Yeah, I was just going to say, I generally suggest to anyone who's in their later years or anyone who's living with a life-limiting illness to specifically schedule extra time with their physician next time they're going to see them. They'll call ahead, say you need time for an end-of-life discussion. They'll give you an extra 15 or 20 minutes, which is a huge gift in and of itself, and go over whether or not CPR is appropriate for you and or whether or not a MOST form is appropriate for you. But anyone in their later years are living with some sort of a life-limiting illness. It's super important.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said at the beginning, there's lots of wisdom I know on this call. And so thank you for those of you who called in for sharing what you know. And we all have a lot of expertise to share. So I always appreciate when a community gets together to talk about this stuff. So get these things put in place. Do it now. If COVID has taught us anything, it really is that we don't know when we're going to need it. And there really is a lot to think about. And I, on some level, really believe that COVID has been a bit of a gift in a way that it makes us understand that we all are vulnerable. And it is so important that we talk about and think about and get these plans made and these documents put in place with our lawyers, with our doctors, so that our loved ones can do what they need for us, and that we give our loved ones the ability to live with what happens to us with a little bit more grace. If they know they've done what they're supposed to because we've had all these conversations, it helps them to live with the loss of us. Does that make sense? And that's why these conversations are so important. I'll tell you, I have young adult children. My children are 24 and 26. And they would say I talk about this stuff way too much. But I am quite certain that they will be very confident that they know what my wishes are. We have a joke in my family. The thing I worry about most is getting some sort of severe cognitive decline that would land me in a nursing home that would cause my family to spend every dollar we have on my care and have them be really in a, a limbo. And so I just don't want that. So we have this joke. I have a thyroid disorder, and so I take Synthroid. And the joke in my family, but this really is the truth, is that when I forget the word Synthroid, they're not to give me any other kind of medicine anymore. And it really does help them to understand what matters to me. So I hope that you can all sort of think through what matters to you and what are the things that you need to have the capacity to do in your life. And that could mean just the capacity to smile. I have no judge about what's right for your life, but really think it through and just kind of think about different contingencies. And you really cannot plan for all of them. There's no way. But think about what makes your life have the quality that matters to you, and have those conversations. And I really do believe that the conversations are at least as important as the documents, maybe more important than the documents. Now, I want to talk about funeral and memorial service planning. I want you to feel free to ask any questions. Oftentimes people say to me, I don't need a funeral or memorial service. When you're dead, you're dead. I believe that. I believe that the dead person is fine. But I really do think that the people who love that person need a communal event to be able to process their grief. Grief is the internal feeling that we have. Mourning is the ability to externalize that and process it. And if we don't have any ritual around it, it's very difficult to externalize those feelings. So while many people don't want to have any event because they don't want to make a big deal of themselves, that's, I think, some of what goes into that thinking. It really isn't for them. It is about them, but it is really for the people who love them. Does that make sense? So I really encourage people to put a plan in place so that their loved ones have that path to walk on. Because if you've ever had to make these decisions at the time of someone's death, you understand that that is a very difficult time. There are about 120 decisions and pieces of information that have to be made, have to be decided and provided. And at the time of a death, we're not in our right minds. It's very difficult to think. Grief is literally a gray cloud that comes over our brain. There is really a physical difficulty in thinking. And so it's not a great time to be making big, important decisions that will reverberate through our loved ones' lives for the rest of their lives. So making our own plans now, when it's not an emergency, when we can think, is really such a gift. Are there questions about that? I see a couple of people have turned on their video, which makes me think they have something they want to ask or share.
Well, Jamie, one thing that I've heard is that, sometimes people are concerned, that if they make a final plan, it'll actually come to be much quicker than they want it to be. Is there any evidence of that?
None. There is no evidence of that. I did my plans almost 12 years ago. Last year did 280 plans for people. I have done plans for thousands of people, and they are living their lives. What they are doing, though, is allowing that to get out of their consciousness. because so many of us worry about it and think if we make the plan, something's going to happen. And I will tell you that someday something is going to happen. And will it happen with a plan in place or without a plan in place? Having the plan is not going to make it happen. Stephen, do you have a question?
Well, no, I see this as being recorded, and I sure would like to have my two kids have an opportunity to hear this conversation. And as you know, it'd be nice to tie my wife down to have her do it. That's a different story. But any chance that the recording will be available to us afterwards, Jamie?
It will be made available. We will do a little editing on it, not too much. And just to clean it up. And then it'll be posted on the AgeWise Colorado website. So it'll be available there. And we can also, if you would like, we can send you the link to the video to everybody who's on this call.
Yes,
That's what I was going to ask for, Bob. That would be great, because Jamie's chuckling because she knows if I can get my kids to see it, I'll be 90% towards having that conversation with them.
I see somebody's poking their head in behind you too.
You like that, huh? That's my icebreaker for video.
Oh,
you know who
that's
that
not a
is?
real person? No, who's that?
It's me.
Oh, I can't see it that close. Oh my God, Stephen, that's hilarious.
It's my virtual background. It's a great icebreaker for serious Zoom calls like this one.
Oh,
Maybe.
I knew that. I did have my dog walk in. I don't know if anybody saw that.
I
So,
saw that.
well, here's the thing I'm going to say. There are some people who will never be able to do these plans. Never. I don't know if that's going to be, Stephen's wife, but I do know my father, who is an estate planning attorney and is 83 years old. I doubt very seriously that he will ever do these plans. And he is someone that, Bob, that, kind of who you're speaking about, somebody who is really pretty sure that if he does a plan, he'll die. And again, I will just say, whether he does a plan or not, he'll die. It's just a question of, will he die in a way that his loved ones are cared for and given a path to walk on? Or will he die in a way that his loved ones will be thrown into chaos and have to make a lot of decisions? And even for me, I mean, I do this all the time, but it's going to feel very different when it's my father. And those of you who are professionals in anything, I wonder if you will agree that your professional brain and your personal brain don't always they don't overlap. And so sometimes when something happens to you that you need your professional skills in your personal life, it's very hard. So please, please get these plans done for yourselves. And the other thing that often people are worried about is if they make a plan and pay for it, what happens if they change some things and they change their mind or they move away? So what happens when we do these plans is we'll go through all the decisions. What's going to happen to your body? What's the disposition going to be? Is it going to be burial? And where would that be? Is it going to be water cremation? And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Is it going to be body composting? And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Is it going to be fire cremation? What's it going to be? Where is a memorial service going to be? Should there be a newspaper notice? Should your family be driven to the service? What kind of register book do you want? Should there be a video that's shown? Should there be flowers? On and on and on and on and on. I'm going to take all of the information that's going to be needed on your death certificate. That's your social security number, your birth date, your parents' names, including your mother's maiden name, what you did for a living, how much education you have, lots of things. Anything that's going to go in a newspaper notice I'm going to take, just so that your family doesn't have to think at the time of a death. You would be shocked at how hard it is for people to come up with their grandmother's maiden name. Even if they know it, they can't come up with it because they can't think that day. So when we have all this done, they don't have to make any of those decisions. They just show up. But if you, and then the money for it gets held by an insurance product. So if you move away, it can go with you. Or let's say you decide you're going to have a fire cremation, and then later on you think, no, I don't want to do that. I've learned it's a pretty brutal process. I really do want to give my loved ones a place to go. I'd rather do green burial, or I'm going to do this new thing, which is body composting. We can always add to a plan. So fire cremation would be the cheapest way to go. We can always add more funds to change something. Or let's say you're going to be buried. We make a plan that you're going to be buried, and then you decide, no, I really want body composting. We can change to that too. We just can't take money out of the insurance product until the time of a death. But if you've changed your mind and what you're going to do in the future is less expensive than what we planned, your loved ones will get the money back. So I want you to know that too. And if you move away, it can be used at any funeral home anywhere. And let's say your family forgets you have it, it just becomes a life insurance policy. Does that make sense? Questions about that?
I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, so I've seen situations where people decide that they want to be cremated, but they also want to have a memorial service with a casket and a viewing.
Uh-huh.
So my question about that is more on the cost side. So let's say that you do elect to do that. So what happens to that casket? Does it?
It depends.
Reused?
It depends.
Okay.
So often what we would do is use a rental casket that has a liner inside of it. And so it can be used again and again. And you know, because most people don't want to burn a casket, you know, it's expensive to buy a casket. And so a rental casket, if you want to have a public viewing, is a good way to do that. And then you can still have a fire cremation. You could still have a water cremation. You could still have body composting, or you could have burial. So if you want to have a viewing, you could do any kind of disposition. And when we're talking about this, they're kind of separate decisions. Like, what's the disposition going to be? So those choices, again, are going to be traditional burial, which would typically mean embalming. So the blood gets removed and it's replaced with embalming fluid, which is similar to formaldehyde. And often that would mean you'd have a metal casket, or you'd have a casket with metal on it. That's traditional burial. And often there would be a vault that's required by the cemetery. That's a liner of the grave. There's green burial, which is natural burial. It is also what Jewish people and Muslim people do, which is no embalming and a biodegradable casket, or in a Muslim situation, likely no casket. And as long as the cemetery didn't require a casket, you could do that. Typically you'd be buried in a shroud. One of the things I worry about is if you have no casket at all, what does that feel like to your loved ones as they're seeing dirt heaped on you? I don't know. It's worth thinking about. Again, I just try to make people's bereavement be as healing as possible. So I think about these things and bring them up with clients if they're deciding that they don't want a casket. So
Hey,
that's,
Jamie,
yes.
Can I interrupt you for a second? Stephen has a question.
Sure, Stephen, go ahead, please.
Oh, yeah, I didn't want to interrupt you. As we recently met with our attorney to update our wills and all that sort of stuff, I mentioned this conversation, Jamie, that you and I had, and she had some concerns or questions about the legal underpinnings of the contract to put money down towards the funeral service that we've discussed. Is that a document which you can share with me before
Sure.
we sign it, that
Sure.
I can just let her, again, I'm fine with you, but she mentioned the question, and then Lorraine said, well, have we looked at it for its legal sufficiency? So that would be helpful for me.
Absolutely. I'm going to write myself a note, Stephen, and I will send that to you as soon as we're done. And what Stephen really brings up is incredibly important. My approach to all of this is completely transparent. And I don't know that that's true with everybody. So it is really important that when you're making these plans, that you're doing it with somebody who you trust, somebody who people you know trust, and that you really are feeling confident about it. And one of the things that's so great with doing the insurance plan is the money is not paid to the funeral home until the death occurs. So that is a third party that's holding the funds. And that's actually beneficial to the consumer. It used to be that funeral homes would put the funds into a trust that they owned. And they were legally allowed, and they still are if they do it this way, to take a percentage out of that account every year. And a lot of funeral homes would use that if they needed a new limousine or, you know, whatever. And it's not so good for the consumer. And if the funeral home would go out of business, that money was gone. So if you're going to do these plans, do them, I would really argue, with a family-owned funeral home, and there are not that many of them anymore. As I mentioned, Feldman's is the oldest family-owned funeral home in Colorado. All of the Ohlingers are owned by one corporation called SCI. They own any provider that says Dignity. They're a huge national provider. Horan and McConaty, up until about 3 years ago, was owned by a family, but now is owned by Parklawn. So when you work with a funeral home that has corporate connection, there's going to be other drivers there. So keep that in mind too. And really work with somebody who you trust and who's happy to say, yeah, here's the documents, take them to your lawyer. I feel very confident about what I do, and I operate in complete integrity, and I only want what you want. So if your lawyer has some questions about it, I'm happy to talk to the lawyer. Or your financial advisor or whomever. I'm happy to have anyone in our meetings because I know what we're doing is a good thing. And if you decide it's not a good thing for you, that's okay too. So thank you for bringing up that thought, Stephen. I do think that that's important, and I'm going to send that to you as soon as we get off this call. Okay, so I'm going to get back to methods of disposition. So we've talked about traditional, we've talked about green, natural, also Jewish, Muslim, no embalming, all wood casket, biodegradable container. And depending on the cemetery, there might be a requirement for a vault, a liner. When there is a requirement, what we do at Feldman's is we don't put anything on the bottom. So the liner is used really to hold up the ground when we're doing it in a greenway, because it's not about protecting the casket. It's really about keeping the cemetery flat. And so we would put the casket in first, and then it's like the lid of a butter dish that goes over the casket. Some cemeteries don't require that. So if it's not required, we don't do it. There is a new method of disposition called body composting. That method was only legalized in September. I was part of the effort to legalize it. And what it is the body is laid in a vessel. It's a pretty low-tech thing. It is a box that has insulation and good airflow. And organic material is laid at the bottom, and then the body, and then more organic material. And it is a 4-to-1 ratio. And what happens is the gut bacteria and the airflow cause heating, and the organic material cause heating that causes the body to decompose very rapidly. Green burial is going to be composting in the ground, but this is composting outside of the ground, and you don't need a cemetery plot to do it. So in about 4 to 6 months, everything has been turned to soil. Everything. There's nothing human about it anymore at the end of that process. And because it's a 4-to-1 ratio of the body weight and the organic material, it creates a lot of compost because there's no way to separate what was mom and what was the organic material. It's all one at that time. So most people will not get back all of what is created in the composting process. Most people will say, oh, I want a bag or two, and they might handle it similar to what people might do with fire cremains. We had a client who just had this done, and he was an organic farmer. He was also a pastry chef. And so once the composting was done, the family got back a couple bags of it, and they are having a memorial service with beautiful pastries. Everybody at the memorial service is getting a plant that they can put this compost with. So it's really a very beautiful thing and environmentally sustainable. And because they're having a memorial service, they're getting their communal needs met. Elise, do you have a question?
I do. A couple questions. So you said it was recently passed. Is that in the state of Colorado?
Mhm.
Okay. And then where does that happen? Like, is the box on property you own, or that Feldman owns, or how does
Not
that-
currently, but it might be in the future. Currently, we are partnering with someone in Arvada, but what we can do at Feldman's is get a ceremonial vessel. So it is a beautiful vessel made out of, what is it called? Beetle kill pine. And so we can have kind of a burial if people want. It's kind of called a laying in ceremony. And I actually would really encourage that, because that taking our loved one from where they are to where they need to be is really helpful. That's true in a burial. And in this composting situation, we could make that sort of like a burial. And the vessel would be brought to our facility where you could even have it in your backyard if you wanted to. And then the body would be laid in, and then the vessel would be taken to a place in Arvada for the composting. And then if you wanted, there could even be a laying out ceremony. In fact, March 20th, there is going to be a laying out ceremony for the first person who was composted in Colorado. It's going to be at a new cemetery, which is called the Colorado Burial Preserve. It's in Florence, Colorado. So it's about an hour south of Colorado Springs. And there's going to be a time that compost is going to be brought out in a ceremonial way and used to feed the land at the Colorado Burial Preserve. So it's really a beautiful thing for the earth. And I believe that because you can have some ritual around it, it can also be a nice healing thing for our loved ones.
Mhm.
Are there other questions about composting? It's very new. It's currently only legal in Colorado. Washington is where it was legalized first. And it might now be legal in Oregon. It's at least in the process of getting legalized in Oregon. I think it will likely get legalized in California pretty soon. And the law around it is that the compost is not supposed to be used for food, to grow food. There's nothing that's toxic about it. I really believe that the reason it's not supposed to be used to grow food is just kind of because of an ick factor. If it's created from our loved ones, the legislators thought that would be icky to use it to grow food.
I have one other question,
Sure.
specifically on this. So in the example you gave where, you get a few bags of what remains and you don't do any kind of laying out ceremony, what happens to the rest and who makes those decisions?
So you would basically donate it. So, and then we would make the decision. And it would likely go to this Colorado Burial Preserve. And we're actually in conversation with one of the cemeteries in town that you would know. Mount Nebo is thinking about it might be good to have it to revitalize the land there as well. So, but you would donate it because most of us are not going to want a truck bed full of compost. I mean, if you have a place to put it, fine,
Right.
but most people won't.
Thank you.
And again, there's nothing human about it at that point. But psychologically, it's going to still, I think, feel like mom a little. Now, another choice from an environmental perspective is going to be water cremation, which is also known as alkaline hydrolysis. It's also known as aquamation. I don't know why mation seems to be, a suffix that we use for this, but we do. So I'm trying to figure out what we're going to call it. And it's not that new of a process, but it's pretty new in Colorado. And we've been doing this a lot now. Oftentimes people will choose fire cremation because they think it's environmentally sustainable. They will say, I don't want to use up space. And they think that that's a good use, that it's not good to use up space for a body. It should be used for other things. But what they're not taking into account is that to do fire cremation, the body is put in an open flame at 800 degrees and fossil fuels are used to create that flame, and all of the tissue is burned away. I'm not going to get too in detail, but it's pretty gross. And then the bones are left. The burning is not long enough to burn the bones. So when we talk about ash, there's no ash. What happens is these bones are taken out of the retort, the oven, and put in something called a cremulator, and they're processed. So what we think of as ash is really ground bone. It's filled with fossil fuel. So when we go and scatter it on things, we might likely kill the things we scatter it on. And it really is a very brutal process with the fire. I think that a lot of times, since we don't talk about this, people think, you're dead and then you're ash. And it isn't that. And it's a fine choice as long as you're making an educated choice. I just want you to know what you're deciding. Elise. Oh.
No, I was going to type something, but I am so glad to hear you say that. And I've mentioned this to you before, you might recall. Most of my loved ones want to be cremated for some of the reasons you mentioned. And I was aware of the process, and I can't process that. I can't do that to my mother, and I can't do that to my husband. And it's something I struggle with, the thought of, when people tell you these are my wishes, and you are the one though who has to
Live
make
with it.
So I'm encouraged to hear of other options that aren't a traditional burial, but I appreciate you acknowledging the reality of what fire cremation, which I guess I've never heard it called that, but I guess because there are other forms now, you need to make the distinction that it's not the only.
Yes, that's one reason. And the other reason is I want people to understand what they're doing. So, and again, not because of judgment, they should just be making an educated decision. So
Right.
we call it fire cremation because it is. It's interesting. We do a lot of burial at Fairmont Cemetery. And one of the people at Fairmont called Jim, who owns Feldman's, and said, hey, I just need you to know, Jamie told the client that after cremation that the bones are pulverized. And Jim said, yeah. And she said, she shouldn't be telling them that. And he said, isn't that what happens? And she said, yeah, but we don't want to tell people that. And we just don't feel that way. We really feel like whatever decision somebody makes is a fine decision, as long as they're really making a decision, that they should know what they're choosing. And if that's their choice, that's fine. We don't get to be the judges of what they do. We just want them to know what they're choosing. Okay.
I'm sorry, Jamie.
Go ahead.
Could you talk a little bit more about the water cremation? How does that actually work?
Okay, I was just going to talk about it.
Okay.
So what happens in this case? The body gets placed in a vessel that it looks, this is going to be a strange way to talk about it, but it looks almost like a place you would make beer. You know, it's metal, it's round. It just kind of, it reminds me of a beer. I can't even think of what that's called, but I can't think of the word synthroid. So just know that. But so the body gets placed in there with about 30 gallons of water and an alkali that is similar to liquid soap. It's denatured alcohol and some kind of potassium. Sorry, Bernie, I'm going to try and speak slow. So denatured alcohol and some potassium goes into a vessel with about 30 gallons of water. The vessel kind of rocks back and forth. And in about 2 hours, the tissue has been dissolved by the alkali. And it is in that water. And that solution is actually a fertilizer. It actually is filled with nutrients. And that 30 gallons, you could have it if you wanted it, but typically most of us wouldn't have a place for it. So the 30 gallons are taken typically to a flower farm. They're donated. If the family would like to get some dropper bottles full, they can have that. And again, if they want all the water, they could have that. I do know of a family that had a farm and they took all the water, and it is wonderful for growing plants. And then the tissue is all dissolved. And so again, like in fire cremation, what's left is bone, and the bones are put through a processor in the same way that they would be in a fire cremation. But what I'd like to do is show you, if you don't mind, can I share my screen, Bob?
Yes. Yeah, that's
Okay,
fine.
great.
Mhm.
So I'm going to show you the difference in them, okay? So here is, let me get to fire cremation, cremains. This is the, can you see this? This is the cremated remains from fire. And you'll see that it's gray, it's kind of brittle looking, it's kind of chunky. You know, you actually can see bone fragments in it. Because of the burning, it just is not processed really smoothly. But in water cremation, this is what it looks like. So it's really very pure looking. It sounds strange to say this, but I think it's beautiful. It's kind of like bread flour. And it really like, it looks like what it is in my mind, that it's life-giving, because it really is a fertilizer. So if you wanted to bury this in a plot, you could do that. If you wanted to use it to plant things, you could do that. And it really would be good. In fire cremation, if you use it for plants, it might very likely kill them because of all the fossil fuels. Okay, I'm going to stop the share. I get real distracted by technology. What questions do you have about water cremation?
So where does that take place?
That's also in Arvada.
Okay.
The place that we use is in Arvada. And eventually I imagine that Feldman's will have its own facility, but currently we partner. At
Is
least
that legal in multiple states, or is that?
it's legal in some states, and you could Google it and see which states it's legal in. But it is legal here, and then I'm guessing 6 or 8 states.
Is this the same thing if somebody is like, I know someone who died and was told she was turned into bubbles. Like, is that what this is? Kind of.
Probably.
Okay.
Turned into bubbles. Okay, I like it. That would, I'm guessing that is what they meant.
Okay. Thanks.
Somebody just asked in the chat, how does it compare to fire cremation? Fire cremation is cheap. That's also why it's very popular, And it is contributing significantly to climate change, by the way. But what has happened with fire cremation is years ago, traditional burial was all anybody did. And funeral homes thought that would always be the case. And so when a few people came and said, oh, I want fire cremation, they made it incredibly cheap because they didn't care about it and they didn't think that it mattered and they didn't think anybody would ever do it. And that has led a lot of people to do it. And it's really discounted the importance of ritual. And in Colorado, Colorado has very, very few regulations about this stuff. Colorado is the only state in the nation that one doesn't have to be licensed to be a funeral director. So if you could pass the zoning regulation, you could open a retort in your garage. So I would be super careful about the very cheap places. You could go somewhere on Colfax and get it done for like $600. I wouldn't recommend that. In fact, I don't know if you remember a few years ago in Montrose, somebody was telling people that she was cremating their loved ones and then was giving back cat litter and cement and was selling those bodies. So be careful of who you use. I would say the average at a well-known funeral home that I would feel confident with you using is going to be about $3,000 for fire. For water, it's going to be about $4,500. And that's the base for just the disposition. That's not us being involved in a memorial service or a newspaper notice and those kinds of things, but the basic cost of the disposition themselves. And Barbara asked how long it's been available in Colorado. I know in the Denver area, it's been around for only about 3 or 4 years. But I don't know how long it's been legal. I imagine it's been legal quite a lot longer than that. It just wasn't being done. And it's been interesting because I don't think that the legislation in the funeral rules had to get changed for alkaline hydrolysis. I know that it did have to get changed for body composting. Somebody is asking me about the history of water cremation, and that is a great question that I should know more about. So I appreciate it. I think it was being done at the Mayo Clinic and at the University of Rochester, I believe, for animals. And then somebody said, this would be good for humans. So Dean Fisher, Fischer, is one of the people who started creating it. And he created it along with a company in England. And I have really found that the UK is way ahead of us in these kind of conversations. They just are better at talking about death. In fact, if you've ever heard of Death Cafe, where people just get together and talk about these things, that started in the UK. They're better at this. So he started, I believe, water cremation with a company called Resomation to make the vessel. There's also a company called, it's bio something, and I'm not going to get it. And then the one that we're using was created by a man in Colorado whose name was Ed Swoboda. And so that's the vessel that we're using typically.
I was curious too if the origins of it come from, ancient culture, from, somewhere, like obviously, like, fire cremation, like we know that has been done in India for many centuries. And so I just wondered if the water origin came from some other culture from a long, long time ago. Just curious.
I don't think so. I think it, but thank you. I like that thought. And maybe I need to do a little more research to see. I don't think so though. And it's interesting that you bring up India, because I think that's often what people think fire cremation is what they've seen in the movies. And I don't think it's even being done that way in India anymore. I think it's being done in an oven. And there is an open air crematory in Colorado, actually, in Crestone. And so people can have an open air cremation. And I think then things do go down to ash because they burn long enough. But I'm not positive about that. And you can't get it unless you actually live in Crestone. And thank you, Lori. Lori said that alkaline hydrolysis was made legal in Colorado when the state changed the definition of cremation. Lori's a lawyer. Thank you. In 2011. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Okay, so these are all the methods of disposition. And water cremation is having a moment right now because Archbishop Desmond Tutu used water cremation to after his death, and that was really about caring for the earth. So he had a casket casket funeral. He was in a pine box at a funeral, so people could have the ritual that they needed and the communal event. And then his body was taken out of that casket and put in this vessel to have the water cremation, aquamation, alkaline hydrolysis. I got to come up with a verb, and I don't know what it is yet. So if you have ideas, please share them with me. So I really think that it is going to really gain in popularity. And quite honestly, the vast majority of the people I'm working with who don't want burial are choosing either composting or water cremation because they're now understanding how brutal a process the fire cremation is and how detrimental it is to the environment. What other questions are coming up?
So one of the,
I've got a question for you.
Please, Chris, thank you.
Okay. So my work is involved in educating people about ageism, and ageism is related, in my opinion, to our reluctance to talk about death and dying. And I just wondered what have you found to help people become more comfortable to have these conversations, because people don't even like to talk about ageism because they don't understand how it directly impacts them. So same with this, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that that is a big part of our societal problem with this. And it's deeply psychologically troubling, but we do live in a society that is so focused on youth. And that has its own, that's a problem. Thank you for doing your work because it is super important. As far as having conversations about death, I think one of the reasons that I'm finding some success in this in talking about it is I'm so comfortable with it. And so what I'm trying to do is model that it's safe. It's safe to have this conversation. And what I'm hoping is that all of you will become ambassadors to have this conversation as well. And I really believe that having it when we're well, when we're not facing a health issue, that can be really helpful. Because what I see, and this speaks to some of the issues I know people on this call are even having, what I see is when people are having health issues, it really becomes very real. And it can be much scarier. And I think that they think, but deeply psychologically embedded, they think they're bringing it to them if they talk about it. I'm really of the belief that anything that we refuse to talk about has too much power over us and is more likely to come to us. I think that, like, from a karmic perspective, like that the things we fear, and maybe karma is not the right word actually, but the things we fear are the things we bring to us. So I guess that's where I am with it, is like, let's just practice. And why I really like doing these kinds of educational events. Most people who are pre-need people like me at a funeral home, they don't do this. They invite you to come to the Red Lobster in the back room, and they show you a PowerPoint presentation of why you need to pre-arrange. And then they arm twist you to get you to make an appointment with them. And then once they get you in the seat, they arm twist you to finalize that. I take it in a very different way. I want you to just feel confident in having these conversations, to know I'm a safe person to have them with, and then have them. And if I'm not the right person, that's okay, but have the conversations, get this stuff taken care of, and stop thinking about it and go about your life. And it's funny how many people will kind of spiral to me, they'll call me and I want to make a plan with you. Oh no, I can't meet with you on Tuesday. oh no, I can't meet with you in 3 months, and keep spiraling. And I think that, sometimes it's because their partner is not willing. But sometimes I think it's that they think if they make that touch point with me, that means they're making plans. So they kind of fool themselves to think, oh, I'm doing what I should be doing. But this ageism is a big deal. You're absolutely right. Any other questions? Did you get what you needed from this call?
Just one quick sort of question, comment, whatever. What I've noticed about the whole ritual of death, burials, and whatever form those take is it's so cultural, and something that started 300 years ago, we're still doing. We don't really even know why we're doing it. So, can you comment on that?
What do you think we've been doing for 300 years?
Or however many years. I mean, like having a casket, putting it on display, people come and view it. Then there's a burial at a cemetery, and that's kind of the traditional view of how this all happens. And it's been changing slowly. You mentioned how cremation came about because, well, it's cheap. So that was the answer for that one. And now we have other ways. So
I would argue that these rituals are much, 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 much older than 300 years. You can see conversations about burial and funerals literally in Genesis. And there is evidence that Neanderthals buried their dead and had ritual around it. And again, having that ritual is super important. Embalming became a pretty common thing, and that's what's called traditional. And I would argue it's only been in effect for close to 200 years. It's since the Civil War is when embalming became a thing. There's no need for embalming. There is literally no need for embalming. Embalming is not natural. It's not environmentally sustainable. It is about protecting the body. And there's not a reason to do it. And even if you want to have a public viewing, you could do that with refrigeration packs or dry ice. So there are ways to do any kind of ritual that you want without embalming. But what I would say, Bob, is that people do need what they know that helps them to grieve. And so if they know having an open casket funeral and a rosary and a visitation, that might be helpful in healing to them. Or if they, like, I'll give you an example in my life. My husband and I are Jewish, but my husband is really just Jewish. He's raised, he comes from Jewish parents, but he doesn't have a lot of his own faith or connection Jewishly. When his grandmother died, and I'll preface this by saying she was not a nice person, she buried her husband, but then she always said she wanted to be, quote, burn up. And really what she was trying to do was to get a rise out of us. And everybody's like, okay, that's fine. And that's what happened. When she died, she was cremated. She died in Chicago, and my husband went to Chicago for the interment, is what that's called. And he called me afterwards and he said, oh, it was so weird. I said, what do you mean? What was so weird? He said, well, we went to the cemetery and we just put her in the ground and walked away. Nobody even said Kaddish. And he doesn't know what Kaddish is, which, by the way, is a prayer that you say at a funeral. I mean, he doesn't know what it means. He doesn't know. There's nothing about it inherently that's meaningful to him, except that's what you do when somebody dies. And he felt really incomplete because they didn't say it. And it's just what he knows. So that's what I would say is, let's have this conversation about, what do you know? What do you need because of what you know?
Right.
And will your loved ones need something? And a lot of times people say, well, I don't want to have a cemetery plot because then it obligates people to go there. Nobody's obligated to go. They just go for the burial. If they never go back again, that's fine. But what if they do need a place to go and you don't have it? That can be problematic.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah,
My
that was a
pleasure.
good explanation. I
Thank
appreciate it.
you. Thanks for
And I
asking.
especially like the part about the embalming, because
Yeah.
that is a fairly recent development. So,
And there's no need for it. And most funeral homes don't know that there's no need for it. They think if you're crossing state lines, you need to be embalmed. That is not true. There's no need for it. And, we talk about why there is. I bet we embalm less than 3 times a year.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
thank you so much for having me. If I can be helpful to you in the future, please reach out to me. And I just really appreciate that you were here today.
Thank you very much.
thank you,
you.
Jamie. This was great. And,
My
and
pleasure.
we will send the video to all of you. So thanks again.
Okay, everybody, have a great day. Stay healthy, safe, and warm.
Okay, thank you.
Right.